Welcome back, everybody. This is the second part of the video introduction to the class, in which I really talk about what's more important, the subject matter itself, which is death. I've been teaching this course for a long time. I can't remember the first time I taught it, but I have made certain choices over the years about which direction to go in, and I've gone in the philosophy direction. One thing this course is not is a course on a course on death and dying. This is a philosophy course rather than a psychology course. This is not a course that is focusing on clinical aspects of dying or how we treat people who are terminally ill or how we might advise people who are grieving or stuff like that. That would be a great course. It's not this course. This course really focuses on what I regard to be fundamental philosophical issues regarding death itself. Things, trying to understand what death is, trying to look at various, what I would call theories of death, and philosophical problems that emerge from those theories. So really, these are really kind of like fundamental issues, philosophical issues regarding the phenomenon of death. And the 4 units are the cover like different aspects of that. I mean, it's not really like a canned, systematic, pre-packaged approach. What I've done basically over the years is offered my students what I regard to be the best and most interesting texts that I have come across in my reading regarding death. And I found that some of them have a very close relation to each other, so I put them into units, and they cover different aspects. But let me just explain, like Unit 1 really begins, as the course does, with Epicurus' letter to Menoicus. Epicurus, as we'll see, has a certain theory of death, and that death is basically the end of all consciousness, the end of all experience, the end of our being. And he draws certain lessons from that. Most fundamentally, that death, because it really can't be experienced, can't be regarded as either good or bad. It's nothing to us because we become nothing at death. Very challenging, very, very challenging, I would say, very, substantive idea about death. But it is that is itself challenged by the second and third readings, which more or less go along with Epicurus that human beings do become nothing or at death, or that their existence comes to an absolute end. But Nagel and Bruckner and Fisher want, in different respects, to prove that death can still be considered a bad thing for the person who dies, which is something that's directly, as we'll see, dismissed by Epicurus. When we talk about death being bad, we are really talking about whether it can be said to be bad for the person who dies. And Epicurus says, no, that makes no sense. It involves us in all sorts of contradictions. Whereas Nagel and Bruckner and Fisher, both of those essays, want to argue that despite the fact that death is the end of all experience, probably, according to them, that it can still be considered a bad thing, a misfortune or evil for the person who died. So really, Unit 1 is really looking pretty thoroughly into that Epicurean view of death and its implications. Unit 2 consists of 2 essays. Hans Jonas' The Burden and Blessing of Mortality, and Glenn Gray's The Idea of Death and Existentialism. Here, the focus shifts to the question of mortality rather than death, and things open up quite a bit. The questions of the first unit really are fairly narrow. What I mean is that Nagel and Bruckner and Fisher are both focused on the specific question of whether death can be said to be a bad thing for the one who dies. And that is a very specific and fairly narrow question. It's an important and interesting question, obviously. But Unit 2 really opens up things quite a bit. And one of the reasons that it does, I think, is because really both of these essays deal with mortality rather than death. I mean, one of the great things about reading Epicurus is that Epicurus forces us to make a distinction between dying and death, and between mortality and death. Mortality really means being the kind of creature that can die. whereas death is the event or the limit that's reached or the end of life, whereas mortality is a condition of life. And both Jonas and Gray, in his description of the existentialist thinkers of the mid-20th century, are really focused on that, the meaning of mortality, what philosophical lessons we can draw from our mortal condition, the fact that we go through our lives knowing that we are finite beings who will eventually die. And there's some, I think, some very interesting ideas explored by each of those. Now, Unit 3 is the most challenging unit of the course. We have two long readings here. This is why Unit 3 is the longest part of the course. We have Plato's Phaedo. And just to let you know, you're really going to be ahead of the game if you actually watch this video. The version of the Phaedo that I have uploaded is in an old PDF of Plato, and there are, I believe, a number of different this is why it's taking so long to open, because it's a rather large PDF of a scan of an old book, I think. What you need to do is to find the Phaedo within that. It's the whole. You don't have to read the whole thing. The actual dialogue, the Phaedo, is in here somewhere. I'm going to download it because this is crazy. It's 25 megabytes. Wow. It's a very large PDF, but you don't have to read the whole thing. It would be silly. Phaedo is long enough. It's just the one dialogue that we'll be looking at. So we open up the PDF. Dialogues of Plato, translated by the great Benjamin Jowett. And you'll see that the Phaedo starts on page 157, and even that you don't have to read the introduction. This is Jowett's introduction, which is really a great introduction, but you don't have to read the introduction and his analysis, right, of the Phaedo. But it's good. He was a great Plato scholar, a great classicist, and so you don't even need to read that. What you do need to read is Plato's actual dialogue, which I'm sorry, let's see if you can find it. He had a lot to say, that Benjamin Jowett about Plato. Gee whiz, what page is it on? My goodness, here we go. Right, so here's the beginning of the dialogue where you actually see the people speaking, and that's Plato. He wrote dialogues. That is page 195. Okay, so if you go to page 195, and I'll send out an announcement about where it begins. So just so when you open that, just don't be alarmed. It's just the one dialogue. It is a long dialogue, but it's the only thing that you need to read in the volume. It's just I like the Jowett translation, so that's the one I'm using. Unit 3 is the most challenging unit, I think. I think I've actually managed to freeze my computer because because the file is so big. In any case, the other reading is Paul Landsberg's The Experience of Death, which is also a longer reading, and is more challenging. So I really think that when you get to these readings, don't lose hope. I mean, they're really wonderful readings, and I have several videos up to try to help you through them, and they're really wonderful readings. Let's see if we can get back to modules. My little Chromebook is just overwhelmed by this huge Plato file. Just, okay. It's okay. We have problems. It's all right. It's all right, kids. Everything will be fine. So the final unit of the course is, again, an essay by Hans Jonas and an essay by Charles Hartshorne. which is really meant to be a kind of a response to Unit 3. Unit 3 is really theories of death, and Plato and Landsberg in their different ways. Plato in his purely philosophical way, and Paul Landsberg in his philosophical way, influenced by his Christianity. He's a very, very Catholic writer. Arguing that basically that Epicurus is wrong, arguing for eternal life, or the immortality of the soul, or the idea of an afterlife. And really fascinating. I think Paul Landsberg's The Experience of Death may be my favorite thing ever written on the subject of death. Really brilliant essay. But Plato and Landsberg are both arguing for some sort of immortality or some sort of survival of death. And Unit 4 is really two 20th century authors who are also arguing that death is not the absolute end, but have a much more moderate and less ambitious theory of how we can have eternal life. You really have to watch the videos to read the text and know what I'm talking about, but kind of a less ambitious, sort of second best approach or theory of immortality, where they have this idea of the book of life that we live on in really in a sort of theological concept, that we live on in God's memory, and but not in the sort of full-blown way that we usually think of an afterlife. Okay. So we get into some really interesting things here. No way I can get into any detail about it now. Probably sounds really boring, but I assure you these are great texts, and they will reward you for effort, for hard reading and thinking. They're really wonderful texts. I think the best things, in my judgment, ever written about death. So I can't help but think that you will get something out of it. So again, welcome to the course. If you have any questions, please let me know.